Hi everyone, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video I'll be talking about the soft palate. I'll be combining learning objectives 4 and 5 for this video. So we'll be looking at not only the makeup and the supply of the soft palate, but we'll also take a look at the characteristics of the 5 muscles that move it around. The soft palate is typically described as a musculomucosal fold. Now, what this means in plain English is that it is a structure that has a bulky core of striated muscle fibers and an outer layer of mucous membrane. There are actually 5 muscles that are going to contribute to that core, and we're going to be talking about them in more detail as we move through the material here. The function of the soft palate is to separate and close off the nasopharynx from the oropharynx. The hard palate can't do that, number one, because it is separating the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, but it also can't act as a valve because it's hard. So having this soft, movable structure allows the pharynx to have a valve to control flow of both air and other particles between its parts. The muscles that make up the soft palate attach to that hard palate, but they also have an additional supporting attachment structure called the Palatine aponeurosis. Now remember that an aponeurosis is a muscle tendon that is broad and flat. The Palatine aponeurosis is the tendon of the muscle tensor veli palatini. Now we can see tensor veli palatini on the right here, and we can see already that it is getting this nice shiny aponeurotic look to it. So it's starting to look more like a tendon than a muscle belly. And that is going to travel inferiorly into the soft palate and turn medially to form sort of a sling that the other palate muscles can attach to. All right, so I find that this is easier to understand if I pull up a diagram. So let's do that here. All right, here we see the tensor veli palatini indicated by the green line. It is going to originate superiorly from the sphenoid bone and from the pharyngotympanic tube, and it's going to travel inferiorly and medially. In the midline here, the right side is going to meet up with the left side, and that's what forms this nice sling that the other muscles here are able to attach to. All right, so let's look at those other muscles. On the superior aspect of the soft palate, we have levator veli palatini sitting just posterior to tensor veli palatini. That is going to originate from the temporal and sphenoid bones and also from that pharyngotympanic tube. So we have 2 muscles here that originate from the pharyngotympanic tube. This is then going to travel inferiorly, where it's going to insert on that palatine aponeurosis. When it fires then, it is going to pull that aponeurosis upward. It's going to elevate the palate and close off the passageway between the nasopharynx and the oropharynx. Inferiorly then, we find our 2 pharyngeal arch muscles originating from the palatine aponeurosis. So we have palatoglossus and palatopharyngeus. When these are covered up with mucosa, they create those, hopefully by now, very familiar arches that mark the beginning of the oral cavity and surround the tonsillar fossa. So we have the palatoglossal arch and the palatopharyngeal arch. Underneath that, though, they're made up of striated muscle that are going to elevate the tongue, so that's palatoglossus, and elevate the pharynx, which is what palatopharyngeus is going to do. The musculus uvulae is kind of a funny little muscle. So its only bony attachment is a tiny little slip onto the palatine bone. But otherwise, it runs entirely between the palatine aponeurosis and the soft tissues of the uvula. Now, the uvula, remember in common parlance, is often referred to as that hangy ball thingy in the back of your throat. When this muscle fires, it's going to take the tissue at the end of the uvula and crunch it up toward the rest of the soft palate. So if you'd like a little demonstration of this, you can look in the mirror and say, ah, and you can usually see it make a little dimple as it pulls the tissue here, making up the uvula up toward the soft palate as the whole thing lifts. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is that all of these muscles are innervated by the vagus nerve except for tensor veli palatini. Now, vagus innervation is what you'd expect for these muscles. They're sitting in the pharynx, and we learned way back in the beginning of the course that vagus provides somatic motor for all of the pharynx. So what is going on here with tensor veli palatini? Why is it the only one that's innervated by the mandibular nerve? Well, the short answer here is that it's not really a pharyngeal muscle. It's an infratemporal muscle that sneaks into the pharynx, and infratemporal muscles are innervated by the mandibular nerve. The slightly longer answer has to do with where tensor veli palatini originates. So we can see it in the diagram here. And it is sitting lateral to this bony structure here. This is the medial pterygoid plate ending in the pterygoid hamulus, or the hook of the pterygoid, which is what tensor veli palatini is going to bend its way underneath here. Okay, so this medial pterygoid plate represents a sort of border between the pharynx and the infratemporal fossa. Now, because tensor veli palatini, and especially the muscular part of that, where its muscle belly sits, is located mostly out here in the infratemporal fossa, it is innervated by the same nerve as these other infratemporal fossa muscles. So we have medial pterygoid, lateral pterygoid, which, remember, are innervated by branches of the mandibular nerve. Okay, and this remains true even though this aponeurosis bends underneath the pterygoid hamulus to enter into the pharynx. The rest of the soft palate muscles, so here's levator veli palatini, palatopharyngeus, palatoglossus would be up here more, and musculus uvulus, are going to be originating medial to this medial pterygoid plate, meaning they are entirely within the pharynx. Therefore, they are going to follow the pharyngeal pattern for innervation, which is vagus. All right, so let's take a look at these muscles in a donor to better understand how they're related to one another. So up here on the left, we have our two superior palate muscles. Anteriorly, we have tensor veli palatini, which we can see already picking up that very tendinous aponeurotic look, even as we see it up here in the nasopharynx. Posterior, we have the levator veli palatini muscle. And levator veli palatini has a very close relationship with the pharyngotympanic tube. So we can see the opening to that right here. Now, both of these muscles have some attachment to the pharyngotympanic tube, but levator veli palatini looks like it's kind of spilling right out of it. It's not, they're just kind of close by, but it definitely has that appearance. Now, moving over to the right, we can see our palatoglossus and palatopharyngeus muscles on either side of the palatine tonsil right here in the middle. So here we're able to see this relationship between the palate and the tongue and the pharynx much more easily. So you can get a better understanding of how palatoglossus will move the tongue up, will elevate it, and how palatopharyngeus will elevate the pharynx here. The musculus uvulae is really difficult to see, even in this image here. So you're going to want to envision some muscle fibers just traveling from superior to inferior through the body of the uvula. And that is a soft palate. So here is a practice question for you. Correct answer here is going to be D, the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is going to supply somatic motor innervation to all of the muscles of the soft palate except for tensor veli palatini, because apart from tensor veli palatini, these are all going to be originating in the pharynx. And that brings us to the end. Thank you for watching.